and welcome back to Sahara TV. For this segment, we'll be covering the deportation of African migrants from various countries around the world. From South Africa to Israel, Africans are facing deportation with the threat of violence and harassment back to the countries from which they fled. First, we will cover the recent decision of the Israeli government to expel African migrants from the country by the plane load. While scores of Israelis have been clamoring for the deportation of migrants, some of which they've called a cancer on the Jewish state, others are progressively calling for a bit more restraint. Today we are going to be talking to Dr. Barbara Harell Bond, a leading scholar on African migration in the Middle East, and she is joining us from Oxford in the United Kingdom. Good afternoon, Dr. Harell Bond. Thank you for speaking to us on Sahara TV. And if you could you give us sort of a brief history on the African migrants who have lived in Israel and in the Middle East?
Well, first I'd like to correct you, if I may,
Sure.
And use the word refugee.
Refugee.
Because the people that we're talking about are fleeing persecution from their home countries. And they're not migrants at all. Migrants come voluntarily. These people have come because they're fleeing persecution. The smuggling to Israel and the background to the problem that we're facing right now in Israel began, back in 2000. Refugees were already fleeing or smuggling themselves across the Sinai to Israel, largely to get work, but they didn't go in so large a number. After the 3-month protest that happened in 2005 in Cairo, where up to 4,000 refugees demonstrated outside UNHCR's office for this period, and it ended tragically with them being dispersed by the police with at least as many as 29 people killed. They started to smuggle to Israel in large numbers, so that today Israel has thousands of African refugees on its territory. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, although Israel has signed the 1951 Convention and has a provision for asylum seekers, it does not recognize these people as refugees, with the exception of the Darfurians who went there. So at the moment, more background, they passed what they call the anti-infiltration law, calling the refugees infiltrators. Mm-hmm. And they are now deporting large numbers of the southern Sudanese to South Sudan. And that's what the protest is about. I mean, that's what we're trying to lobby against.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned there are large numbers of refugees coming from Sudan. Are there other African refugees that are also being affected by this deportation?
There are refugees from lots of different places in Africa, but the largest numbers are Eritreans and Sudanese. But there are also a number of refugees from the Ivory Coast. I mean, most any conflict in Africa that you could think of, individual people have fled and managed to get to Israel. I should also point out that refugees are fleeing directly from Sudan, and there seems to be traffickers actually capturing Eritrean refugees in Sudan and taking them across the Sinai. And of course, they have been trapped in the Sinai, some of them in camps for long periods of time. They've been tortured. There are allegations of organ theft, and of course the traffickers have been extorting large sums of money from them. So it's a really terrible situation that both exists in the Sinai and in Israel.
Mm-hmm. Now, have the refugees largely lived peacefully and at ease within Israel and the settlements that they have come to be deported from now? I mean, has it been largely without incident, or has it now become? Is there more crime, or what has changed now?
Well, what's happened most recently is that there has been a kind of fascist movement, if I may say, of Israelis who object to their being there, and there have been attacks on the refugees. In fact, the Israeli human rights NGOs call them pogroms against the African refugees. So there's been firebombing and injuries, and some of the Israelis who have perpetrated this violence against the refugees have been arrested, but largely it's been tolerated because the government itself has made anti-refugee comments in public, and so encourage this kind of thing. And the Israelis are also building a camp allegedly to put all of them in, a detention camp on the border of Egypt. The situation is very, very tense in Israel.
Mm-hmm. Now, the refugees are actually being offered money in the tune of €1,000 or so to willingly go back to their countries. Now, as far as pardon?
To South Sudan, yes.
South Sudan, but other countries, no.
No, it's just that program of giving them funds to resettle in South Sudan. It's just for the Southerners. And you should take note, your audience should take note of the fact that many of these people being sent to South Sudan have never been there. They've been born in Egypt. So they have no knowledge of their country. And they'll be landed in Juba. There will be nowhere for them to go.
Mm-hmm. Right, exactly. I was watching several reports, and some of them have no personal knowledge of the countries that they're being sent back to, which, of course, complicates the situation for them. Now, back to the sort of the atmosphere in Israel, even prior to this. I mean, is there anti-African sentiment? Is it a change in? Is it becoming a more intolerant state towards blacks in general in Israel?
Well, certainly there's a racist element, but the main motivation is trying to keep the Israeli state Jewish, and there's a real hostility towards all foreigners.
Mm-hmm. And also, I came across a very interesting article saying that there's a website even targeting businesses and employers who are willing to employ these refugees as well in Israel.
This is just bizarre. Because of course there's a need for labor, because Palestinians are being restricted from working in Israel and have been for a long time. So there's a need for labor. So refugees have been able to move into the informal economy, even if they didn't have the right to work. And they work in hotels, they work on kibbutzes, and now, as you said, they have this new website to target people who are employing them for attack.
And so are these refugees? Are they accepting? Are they willing? Are they wanting to go back? Or are some of them fighting to stay? And do they have any sort of legal recourse in order to appeal some of these deportation decisions?
Well, Anat Ben-Dur and another lawyer have taken a case to the Supreme Court to try to stop these deportations. Because, of course, as we talked about, that people who haven't even lived there, don't have land rights, won't really have a place to go to, say nothing about enough money to get started with a new life. There's also a great deal of trouble in South Sudan. There are thousands of refugees from Kordofan and the East Nile coming into South Sudan, and because of ethnic wars that have been going on, there is now a new outflow of southern Sudanese refugees to Uganda, Kenya, and Ethiopia. So it's a ridiculous situation to be sending people who've been living in Egypt for years and now living in Israel for years, sending them back to South Sudan. It's a war situation. Although Juba itself is quiet, the rural areas around are not.
Mm-hmm. Now, as far as how Israelis are reacting, we already discussed there's one side, sort of, and obviously we don't want to paint everybody with a broad brushstroke, but some want the migrants gone. They're claiming that they are increasing crime in communities, while others are saying that Israel itself was created because Jewish people fleeing from persecution needed a home. And so is there a side that is uncomfortable with the way the Israeli government is attempting to treat black refugees?
Well, of course, many Israeli citizens are horrified at the treatment of the stranger, the foreigner, because, of course, they do know that the country itself was created out of the persecution of the Jews. And so a lot of people have a very guilty conscience about what's going on. And there are some very good NGOs that are doing their best, both legally and advocacy-wise, and also in terms of providing humanitarian assistance to the refugees. Mm-hmm. But the overwhelming sentiment within the country and within the government, within the Knesset, is hostile.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which is quite unfortunate. Now, moving on, is this a legal move under international law? Under international refugee law, is it legal for any government to send back refugees who've claimed or are seeking asylum in a country?
Well, absolutely not. The principle of the 1951 Convention is the right to non-refoulement, not to be forced back to a country where you fear persecution. So, I mean, Israel is absolutely violating international law.
And is there, again, international law, there's no sort of international police force to tell Israel to stop what they're doing, of course.
Unfortunately, the only sanction on a state would be for another state to take it to the World Court. But because states, I can think of no state that has a clear conscience on such matters as dealing with refugees, and no state is obviously going to take another state to court for violating international law.
And is there potentially a fear that this could happen to African refugees in other parts of the Middle East, that this could be setting a precedent, if you will, for the deportation of African refugee seekers?
Well, I mean, deportations have been happening, for instance, regularly in Egypt. Refugees over the last, since 2007, the standards of treatment of refugees in Egypt has been declining, and many, many refugees have been refooled. Mm-hmm. We had a Liberian case who was sent back to Liberia, had a refugee card, and many Sudanese are locked up and refooled. And of course, when this happens, for example, if it happens to someone who's been to Israel, having gone to Israel is in Khartoum a treasonable offense. And we know about what happens to deportation of failed asylum seekers when they get back to their countries. They're usually handed over to the security. But Israel isn't exactly a precedent, although on the scale that it's doing it, it certainly is. But for example, just this last 10 days in Morocco, there have been violent attacks on sub-Saharan African refugees all over the country, both refugees and migrants. there have been killings and trying to force these people out of Morocco. Unfortunately, it's happening too much, and unfortunately, the standards of treatment of refugees generally in the world is very, very bad. And I understand that your audience is Nigerian, and it's interesting. Nigeria is also host to many refugees from all over Africa and maybe other parts of the world as well. But on our website, which some of your audience may be interested in looking at,
the Fahamu Refugee Program, correct?
It's www.f for Freddie RLAN.
Okay.
We don't have a single NGO in Nigeria that's providing legal aid for refugees or who is watching out for refugees. Now, there may be NGOs there that we don't know about, but we haven't found them.
Yeah, that would be a very interesting topic for future study. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Harell, for speaking with us today. The issue of African refugees in Israel is one that we will continue to follow up on. But we definitely appreciate your contribution to the show, and we hope to have you back on here soon.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
No problem. Thank you.